Hello everyone. Today we're going to be talking about analysing data from qualitative research methods. And to do that, we've got an ensemble cast. There's me from a couple of years back, there's a colleague of mine from the United States, there's me from now, and I'm using some ideas and examples from the work of Johnny Saldana. You first met him back in week 1. He's the guy having a blue collar rant. You've done your research, and you might have done an ethnography or conducted in-depth interviews or done some walking focus groups or some participant observation or a combination of all of those. Now, what are you going to do with all of that information? One big difference between quantitative data and qualitative data is that often with quantitative data, you do your analysing before collecting your data. Think about the idea of a survey. You've organised your questions, so you've already done your coding or categorising of the data, and so it's quite easy to organise your data afterwards. Often with qualitative data, you do your thinking about the data, the organising of it, thinking about categories and themes and coding it after you've gathered your data, or sometimes in the process of gathering it. That's in many, if not most cases. Of course, if you're doing highly structured interviews, that might be a bit different, as that would be more aligned to the way you gather data for a survey. But for most qualitative research gathered through semi-structured interviews and focus groups and participant observation, you do your analysing of the data afterwards. And analysing really just means to think about how you can chunk the information down so you can make sense of it.
So that's what we're talking about today. Now, often it can be quite overwhelming, and I've certainly felt that many times when I've been presented with a large amount of data, and you will have in the best projects a great deal of data, and it feels overwhelming, very much like the metaphor of this children's room that I've got in the picture here. So if you just think about the fact that you've already been doing lots of organisation, perhaps of your own rooms or other people's spaces. You go into a messy space and then you organise and get it organised, and that's what you're doing with qualitative analysis. You're taking what feels like a lot of information and then transforming that into an order that makes sense to you. And I guess I'd just like to stress that the way in which this particular room is organised might be different if it was belonging to somebody else. And that's the same for your data as well. What you're doing is your view of the data. Somebody else might use that exact same data and find a different view or have a different perspective of it, even if it's only very slightly. In other words, what I'm trying to suggest is that it will feel overwhelming at times to be presented with a whole lot of qualitative data. However, you have been there before in your life where you've had lots to do, needed to get something organised, even if it was a bedroom, and you've been able to do that in some way. The idea of analysing your qualitative data is really about making sense of it, making meaning from what you've generated or collected. It contributes fantastically to knowledge about our society and can even contribute to changing policy and practices. For example, there's a young woman doing a PhD at the moment, and she's looking at homeless provisions for young people, and I know that the way in which people have set up these homeless facilities is quite different to what the young people have experienced and needed, and therefore once her information gets out and their voices are heard, that will change policies and practices so that people provide housing facilities that are more in line with what young people need. That's one example. There are many, many more about how your research can actually make a difference in the real world. The research process always needs to be rigorous, by which I mean that it has a lot of depth, you do things thoroughly, you make sure that you're reflexive. It should be replicable in that perhaps somebody else can do the same process, because I might do it differently and my standpoint is different. There might be some differences in the process. However, we're always transparent about what it is that we do, even transparent about making mistakes or learning from our experience. So there's nothing wrong with making mistakes when you're doing research. And if I think about the putting quote marks around it, the hard scientists, they're always happy to be proven wrong because that's something new to be learned. And it's a good idea to take that sort of attitude that there's nothing really right and fixed about what it is that we do. It's a learning experience for us, and we learn from other people in the gathering of our data. For me, reflexivity is really crucial. You're the research instrument, really. It's not about the test tubes or whatever, it's about you, and therefore you do affect the outcome of your research. So you need to be thinking about your involvement and be clear about that as well. Even to the extent that people have written articles, I know some colleagues at Flinders University have written about how they were critical of somebody's story, and that was a learning experience for them through reflecting on that. Why were they critical of a woman who, for example, had not left a domestic violence situation? When they were listening to her story, they found themselves saying, and reflected on this together afterwards, found themselves saying internally, not to her, internally, well, I don't understand why she was there for so long. Why didn't she just leave? When they reflected on that situation later on, they wrote that up into a paper criticising themselves for that approach rather than the woman, and then explored that. And if they hadn't done that, that might have shaped the way in which they recorded that and presented that information later on as a critical analysis of that particular woman's experience. As I said when I was talking about doing interviews, an interview is the result of an interaction between a researcher and the person being researched. And some people are better at doing research via interviews than other people, and so you can see how that would be quite different. If we're doing semi-structured interviews where there's a lot of scope for different responses, then one person might ask one question and elicit quite a different response from another person. It's not just a one-way thing at all. Interview data generation comes from an interaction, so it pays to remember that as well. Hence why I hesitate when I say around, can we replicate this particular data? We can replicate the process, but you've got different people in there, so it will be slightly different as well. But important to be transparent about the way in which you go about you doing your research. So the phases of analysis really are to get kind of organised. You will have done some transcriptions, you need to keep them in a place where you can access them very easily. You've got to think about now, how am I going to keep all of this information stored? These days, I do a lot of that on my computer, so stored virtually. You also need to familiarise yourself with it. And if you're doing a transcription of an interview or a focus group, then you will be already in that process of getting very familiar with what people have said, and you'll begin to be thinking about it and thinking about some themes and some patterns and some comparisons of different interviews as well. For me, that actually means listening to the interview again as I'm transcribed. The transcription is done, then I would read that again, and I might make some corrections, grammatical correction. Then I usually send that out to the person being interviewed, and then it comes back in. And by the time I've read and reread that story, I'm quite familiar with much of the detail. So you need to be familiar with the story of the interview. And then it goes through a kind of a coding process, and ways in which you can do that. You can compare and contrast. You can look for patterns, not just of frequency, but of the significance of something. You can look for the silences. So if I think about look for patterns, one of the patterns that I found in my foster care research is the number of women who've really been treating children very badly. I call them cruel women, and it doesn't matter what role women have been in regard to the children. All of these women have been quite cruel. So there have been stepmothers and foster mothers and birth mothers and aunties. When it comes to searching for silence, the story that I want to tell there is of several years ago, when the whole idea of hijabs and women covering themselves because they identified as Muslims, there was a lot of debate, a lot of conversation happening in the community. What was going on then was lots of people were talking about the hijab. There were feminists talking about it. There were shock docs talking about it. It seemed like everybody in the community was talking about the women wearing these hijabs, headscarves. But one of my colleagues, again at Flinders University, did an analysis, a media analysis of all of this debate, and discovered that there was an enormous silence, because the one group of people who weren't talking about wearing hijabs were Muslim women. And so you're also looking to try and hear what's not being said in your data as well. And then usually what we're wanting to do is interpret in light of some social theory as well. So in the terms of the Muslim women, then we're looking at the marginalisation again, or the silencing of particular groups in the community. And this is sometimes called an epistemic violence, where there's violence done to a group of people because their knowledge is not included. So lots and lots of social theories, as you will have come across, and so we think about all of this in light of those theories and sometimes generate new theories ourselves. And then you reread all of that data in light of your interpretations and reflect on that process, familiarising yourself. The words that I like to think of are immersion and incubation, where you're repeatedly reflecting on your notes, maybe re-listening your recorded material, rereading of your written material, thinking about what the participant has said, what you've read, in order to discern a pattern. The idea of coding is all about identifying, sorting, highlighting, and you might be down to the level of words, or maybe down to the level of phrases, or maybe down to the level of concepts. So what you're trying to do is group things that you think are alike together, and I stress again, it's your grouping of it. The picture I've got here of all these little bugs is somebody's sorting of this particular phenomenon in the natural world. You're doing is very similar to somebody who might, an entomologist who's trying to understand the world at the level of bugs. You're doing a similar thing. You're just sorting and categorizing as any scientist sorts and categorizes. When any human being, we all sort and categorize all the time. Tools that you need, very simple. You might need some index cards. You might be using that. Might be using a mind map, using simple highlights. You can also use a computer program, which I did for my PhD project.
Joining me is a colleague, Professor Amanda Flame. And Amanda works at both Michigan State University and James Madison College in Michigan, which, as you would know, is in the United States. Amanda has very different research interests to mine. She's currently exploring the risk of trafficking among Cambodian and Burmese men and boys into the Thai fishing industry. And she's also looking at the causes and consequences of statelessness in Thailand and Nepal. Different research interests, but we share an interest in qualitative research. Amanda agrees with me that sometimes computer programs are helpful for coding, but you don't always need them. And this is what she has to say on the topic.
What does coding look like? Often people think that they need a sophisticated software to do coding. And in fact, this is not true. Often sophisticated software is an advanced way of helping you manage your qualitative data, but you can very well code by hand. You can print things out and code by hand and do it the old-fashioned way. If your research questions and your data, the volume of data, the number of interviews you've done, or the number of pictures you have becomes quite large, that's one of the ways in which qualitative research software can be very helpful to help you manage that, but you can do it by hand. So coding can be scribbling on the paper. That is a way of taking notes to make summary statements about what's going on. You can use highlighters. That's a really effective way, for instance, of just getting a visual understanding of how things work. So your first pass at coding can be just taking notes on the page. Then your second pass of coding, when you're thinking about how do these codes work together, you might give certain codes a single color, so that later when you're flipping through to say, I want to find the code emotion, or you want to find the category emotion, you're looking for all the codes, sad, happy, disgruntled. You've coded them all blue, you've colored them all blue, so that you don't have to go back and read everything at that level. You can just visually find everything blue and how it works together. So again, every step from the coding process to the write-up process is moving from the most in-depth and then back out to the biggest theoretical. So visual cues about how things fit together are very effective in helping you organize your ideas and moving it towards write-up. If you are doing coding by hand, there are some key ways to do it effectively. If you're coding by hand, you want to make sure that you give sufficient space on your actual document to write on the document. So while it is not necessarily best practices in terms of ecological citizenship. You want to create large margins where you can write on the side, and you want to make sure that you at least double space so that you have space to write on the text what it is that you're noticing and what's happening. And then to write again about that process. There's a first pass where you're taking close notes, and your second pass where you're making notes about your notes. You're moving from codes to categories. How do your codes work together? Another thing that you might think about using beyond highlighters, which gives you a good visual guide to your data, is colored sticky notes. And this is because if you have a stack of documents and you know that you've coded emotion blue, you can have colored sticky notes on every page where you need to go back and find that information. So that becomes very useful as well as a way for you to quickly access your data.
Today I'm going to go into a bit more detail about coding. And as I said, coding is one method of analysing qualitative data. Let's hear what Amanda has to say on the matter.
Why do you code? For instance, if you're trying to understand what a forest is, the coding work is done at the most minute scale. What is going on at the grass level, within the reeds, within the trees? You're using that then, your cumulative work at the coding level is to be able to move up to 30,000 feet to theoretical work, to say this is a forest. So you might be able to move at the coding levels to say this is grass, this is a tree, this is a plant, you're moving up and up and up. This is flora, this is fauna. And then you are defining a forest from that. So the coding work is work that you do at a very small scale. But the aggregate of that work is to develop an understanding of how these codes work together to inform theory about a broader question. So you're moving from textual, small, minute level to categorical frameworks and then to theoretical interventions in your work. So for instance, you don't even have to know what's happening in that text here to see what's happening with respect to the analytical process. So you have a set of text, you have one paragraph where somebody's explaining something about their life, and along the side might make notes about what's happening. Those notes are codes, so that when you come back to look at that page again, whether you're looking at that actual document, physical document, or an electronic document, you don't have to read every single tiny thing. You can just look at your codes along the side to get an idea, a summative understanding of what's going on. That's the first process of coding. From there, you're thinking about how those codes relate to one another. So some of those codes are in and of themselves sufficiently summative to understand your research question that it becomes its own category or theoretical intervention. Others might be related to one another, and then you will collapse them together into a single category. So for instance, you might realize that you've coded a set of text as happy, sad, disgruntled, and you realize that in and of themselves, they're too specific, but as a group, the code emotion or the category emotion is a more useful category to summarize each one of those codes. So you're moving from codes, which are textual level or smaller level pieces of information, to categories where they fit into one another. And then from those categories, you're developing an idea of, here's a theoretical intervention I want to make. Given my text, here are the understandings that I have, the explanations I have of a particular phenomenon, or given these visual representations of a particular phenomenon, here are my explanations. I've moved from thorough coding at the textual level to broader understandings and explanations of what's going on. Thinking always with similarity, difference, sequencing, and frequency. Those tend to be some of the key ways of thinking about how codes and categories relate to one another.
Thanks, Amanda. I couldn't have said it better myself. So that's an overview of what we do when we code. But what is a code exactly? Over to Amanda again.
This is at the stage of research where you have collected your qualitative data, you have often transcribed it, or if it's visual, you have a visual representation. You're using photos, drawings, etc. At this stage now you're ready to do your analytical work. So what is a code? Paraphrasing Saldana, a code symbolically assigns a summative or evocative attribute for a portion of qualitative data. You're doing research to understand why things happen, what are relationships between phenomena. So when you're coding, you're looking at your qualitative information, your data, for patterns of similarity. So once you've done interviews or focus groups or participant observations a number of times, now you're looking across those different experiences for similarities or differences with respect to what people say or what people do. So this is to say that if you hear somebody speaking at length about why they came to Duke, you might give a code, why I came to Duke. That would be a potential summative statement about a very long amount of text or a diverse amount of visual data. That would be one option for coding that long amount of text. I'm going to give some examples of what different codes are and why you might use them. We use codes specifically to refer to our research questions. You might be looking at frequency. How often do they do something? Or how often do they say that they do something? You could also be looking at sequence. Sequence is particularly useful for thinking about causation. How often do they do it? What do people do? And do they do it before or after something? So in order to think about causation, you need to be able to say that A comes before B and that therefore A causes B. This is how qualitative work can be quite useful, is that you can in fact code for sequencing and thinking about causation. Some people code to understand what's going on. They're using exploratory coding. They try as much as possible to just let the text tell them what's happening. Other people know which questions are most important, and they're going to disregard, 20 to 80% of the interviews that they've conducted in order to get to the meaty questions that they really want people to answer. Both are fine ways of going about coding, but it depends on your discipline. It depends on your research agenda. So if you know which questions are important, if you know what you're going to focus on, then you've already done some coding in your head. And in that case, you can predefine your codes and say, I'm going to code on emotion, I'm going to code on X, Y, and Z. You can assign that code a color or a number or whatever, and then you can go in to the text and code that way so that you're just marking it according to the code. So some of it is very inductive, meaning that the coding process happens iteratively by virtue of going through it and building your theory from the ground up. It's called grounded theory. And some coding is very deductive. You know what's important. It's just a matter of pulling out themes and the codes that help you clarify an idea.
Great, thanks Amanda. This is the full quote from Saldana. I think Amanda might pronounce his name a little differently to the way that I do, but that's okay. What he says is, a code in qualitative inquiry is most often a word or short phrase that symbolically assigns a summative, salient, essence-capturing and or evocative attribute for a portion of language-based or visual data. The data can consist of interview transcripts, participant observation field notes, journals, documents, open-ended survey responses, drawings, artifacts, photographs, video, internet sites, email correspondence, academic and fictional literature, and so on. The portion of data coded during the first cycle coding processes can range in magnitude from a single word to a full paragraph, an entire page of text, or a stream of moving images. In second cycle coding processes, the portions coded can be the exact same units, longer passages of text, analytical memos about the data, and even a reconfiguration of the codes themselves developed thus far. He is making 4 points in that one paragraph. A code is a word or short phrase that sums up a portion of data. The data can come from a whole range of places. And his third point is that the size of the selection of data you code can vary from a tiny portion to something much larger or longer. He also mentions something new, a first cycle of coding, something we'll come back to. But basically, coding isn't something you do once. And Amanda has more to say on that point in a minute. Saldana's final point is about second cycle coding. And during this, what he's talking about is going back over the same material or looking at a larger section of the data or doing something like writing an analytical memo, on which Amanda has quite a lot to say. But first, let's listen to her talk about cycles of coding.
Distinct way to talk about cycles of coding. Generally, we think about coding as an iterative process where you move from the small level to the big level and back to the small level. And you do it often, even if you're not writing about it in your memos, you tend to do this intuitively. So your first cycle codes you approach as what emerges from the data at the textual level. So you're reading, examining the data thoroughly, and you get your first impressions, and you are going page by page, line by line, making notes about what you understand. Second cycle coding is when you step back and look at your notes and you're categorizing or collapsing your codes to understand your patterns. And the patterns, again, are around frequency, sequence, similarity, and difference, although there could be other kinds of patterns as well. And cycle 1 and cycle 2 happen over and over and over again. So one thing to think about is if you have 15, 30, 150, 2,000 interviews, you don't want to do first cycle coding through all of those interviews first. It's not always necessary. Your first cycle codes you could do if you select out 5, 20 interviews. You can select them out and do commit to doing first cycle coding through those first 5 to 20 interviews. And then those can give you your set codes. That gives you a pretty good idea of the main codes and themes you're going to write from. It can obviously emerge that other codes will become important as you do coding with other interviews or other visual data. But often people think they need to do first cycle coding, this very slow in the trees process, through all of their data, and that's actually not really true. You can do a sample of that first and then do a second cycle with that sample, get an idea of what codes could be collapsed, which codes could be expanded, which codes are going to be important, which codes are not going to be important, and then use your second cycle coding process to guide you through the coding of the rest of your data, the rest of your interviews, or the rest of your visual data. Always keeping in mind that you might still come across things that you didn't expect. So it's not that you just want to say, I've done 5 interviews and I'm just going to use that. You still want to have an eye open for things that might emerge in your subsequent interviews. It's just that you don't necessarily need to be quite as in the trees about it. Your third cycle coding is actually a lot like memo writing. It's considering the substantive, theoretical, political, methodological interventions that you're making on the basis of your coding process. So cycle 1 and cycle 2, you're going in and out of all the time. And cycle 3 it's good to go in and out of all the time by keeping a memo, but this is where you're going eventually when you're writing up.
A couple of useful things to have or to do at the beginning of analysing your data is a code book and a habit of writing analytic memos or doing some journaling or keeping notes on what you're finding. First, we'll talk about a code book or a code list, and I've got an example here which I've taken from Johnny Saldana's work. So you'd set up, and you could do this in your manually or in a computer. I'd probably tend to use a computer program and something like Excel, but I would have things like on the left a short description, which would be the name of the code, or a longer description, which would be a sentence describing some of the qualities or the properties that go into the code. Then I'd be thinking about inclusion and exclusion criteria, what's going in and what's not going in. Really good examples that best represent the code, and some things that are kind of atypical, examples that are different but are still included. And then a category of close but no, examples that could be mistakenly assigned to this code, but I'm not adding them. Here's an example of a code book that I filled in a bit. I've got childhood as my short description or my title. My long description is participants reflecting on their childhood experiences. In are reflections of participants up to the age of 18, and out is reflections of participants over the age of 18. And examples, when I was a kid, we went camping every summer. I was only about 10 when our family was homeless for the first time, so there's some examples of what would be going into that code book. Atypical exemplars are things like children having adult responsibilities. Many children care for parents or siblings before the age of 18. So they look as if they kind of sit outside that reflection of childhood because they are doing adult responsibilities, but they're still under the age of 18, so they're included. Close but no are people over the age of 18 who have absolutely no adult responsibilities. So in effect, their life is still kind of childhood, but they're over the age of 18, so they don't fit my inclusion criteria at all. So that's an idea of a code book, and you can use that for yourself so you can remember what you've done, and you can also use that to present to academic or workplace supervisors so they know what you've done as well. And another thing that you might like to do is memo writing or journaling, or somehow keeping a record of your thoughts on the way through. And I'm going to hand over to Amanda now to talk about memo writing.
I'm going to talk about memo writing and why memo writing is important for the coding process. In order to code, you are writing in on the text, whether you're doing this manually or with a software. You're writing summative, clarifying statements about line by line or paragraph by paragraph information. You're writing on the data. A memo is really important because a memo will help remind you along the process about what did I write about today? What struck me today? Did I notice something that I expected to see, that I expected to learn based on my literature review? Or did I learn something totally new? What patterns are emerging that I'm noticing when I'm coding? What contradictions are emerging that I'm noticing as I'm coding? And what possibilities or problems am I encountering as I'm doing this? So your memo writing is important for giving you a log of your coding process, as well as it enables you to write about how your coding and how your data are helping you think about your lit review and your final conclusions. Coding is a slow process. People who are used to doing statistical analysis, you finally get your data organized in a way that you can run a model, and you press the button run, and it runs, and now it's analysis. Coding is much slower because it's in the reads, thinking about it, and then stepping back. So keeping a memo and keeping different types of memos to help remind you where you are in the process and what you're thinking about is a really important way of moving from the coding to the theoretical intervention. And it also helps you write up. So it is a way to feel like you're making progress when it feels very slow.
Not one method for analysing qualitative data, nor is there one way to do your coding. And according to Johnny Saldana in his coding manual, which I recommend, there are many ways to code. In fact, I counted 24 coding methods in his book, which were listed under 6 categories of coding. And these are first cycle coding methods. There's more at the second cycle coding stage. So first up, he's got grammatical methods, which he says doesn't refer to the grammar or structure of a language, but the basic structure of a technique. For example, attribute coding, which I'll show you in a minute. Then he's got what he calls elemental methods or primary approaches to qualitative data analysis, which includes initial and concept coding. Then he's got what he calls effective methods, which is coding for emotions, values, conflicts that people might talk about. Then he's got literary and language methods, coding from literary traditions, so coding for performance, motifs, and narrative terms like conflict, resolution, flashback, etc. Then he's got what he calls exploratory methods, which is preliminary coding. So before you start refining the coding, it might include assigning a single code to a large chunk of data to get an overall picture. And then he's got what he calls procedural methods, and these are following pre-established coding. An example that Saldana gives is around family violence, where codes are already set up for the causes of violence, for example, alcohol, drugs, etc. As I've said, there's lots of ways to code, but before I go into some specific examples, let's listen to Amanda on the topic.
There is not a standard system for coding. The codes that you use and the process that you use will depend on your research question, which makes it often confusing and makes you feel like you don't know what you're doing. But again, this is where elevating your intuition to logic really helps. If you have a long, extended passage and people are talking about something that you could code multiple ways. You could code some text on whether it's emotional or whether it's descriptive of a particular situation, on sequence or frequency. All of the options about how you would interpret what somebody says, those options are great to think about, but it's important to keep your research questions in mind. Each option for coding, for summarizing a statement or summarizing a passage or summarizing visual data is not equally important to your research question. If somebody is describing an experience, and the actual description of that experience. When I was a child, I did something with my family that was really exciting. You could code that very short amount of information as memory. You could code that short amount of information as the actual sequence of events of what happened. So you want to know your information is about, tell me about your experience in this particular historical moment. And you're literally coding that memory or that passage as event 1 happened, event 2 happened, event 3 happened, then memory doesn't really matter as much as the actual sequencing of events that they're telling you or the events themselves that they tell you about. So it depends on what are the guiding concerns of your research. And sometimes you might code one passage multiple ways because it strikes you as important in multiple ways. And that's completely fine because that's your first pass coding. Then later you're going to check back in. Let's say you've coded 2, 3, 4 times. Later you're going to come back to those codes and say, what was really important here and how does it inform what's happening in other parts of my analysis? And then you kind of clean it a bit. You clean up your ideas about what's important about that. This is why qualitative work is really subjective. It is why claims to representativeness and reliability and generalizability, the same kinds of standards used in quantitative data, are truly almost not even useful in qualitative data, but they do systematically, qualitatively different kinds of work than quantitative data. And as long as your memo writing is thorough, today I noticed emotion. Today I was noticing how people were inconsistent with their memories. Today I was noticing, certain things. When you're thorough with your memo writing, which is documenting how the coding process is going and how your codes fit together, then you can be very clear with people who are reading your work about what did you do to be thorough and transparent and reliable in your coding process. Were you honest with your data in the way that you say that you were? So the concerns of, am I doing it right? It's almost impossible to answer that except to say that, are you doing it thoroughly? Are you taking notes about what you're doing? Are you constantly checking in with your research question and with the lit review that helped you devise this whole agenda in the first place? That will really help you be sure that you're answering your question. That's what you're trying to do with your coding, answering a question or set of questions.
What I'll do now is go through some examples of coding so you get an idea of it in a bit more detail. I'm not going to do all of them. I've just selected out a few that I thought might be useful. I don't want to bore you to death, but the point is really to let you know that there's a variety of ways in which you can do your coding. So if this is something you're going to take into the workplace or into postgraduate studies, then I do recommend Saldana's book. So attribute coding is also called descriptive coding. This is really, really useful for pretty much all qualitative research, but particularly good when you've got multiple sites and multiple participants. And what you're doing is noting basic descriptive data right at the beginning. So demographic information, anything else about the participant that you need to know, the fieldwork setting, for example, if you were in a school, how you collected your data. Did you do it via focus group or interview? When did you do that? And then perhaps you might include a list of topics that you talked about as well. Here's an example of attribute coding filled out with a bit more detail. So we've got 18-year-old Hayden, who's a first-year university student. He's male, Anglo-Australian, identifies as gay. He comes from an upper middle class background, no religion. The data format was semi-structured interview and the time frame was March 2013 for an hour from 2 p.m. And the sorts of topics that were talked about were the challenges of being in first year, making new friends, joining university clubs, and balancing paid work and study. In vivo coding is one of Saldana's elemental or primary coding methods, and it's also called literal, verbatim, inductive, and emic coding. It really means coding using the actual words or phrases in the data. And this comes from a conversation between a researcher and a 16-year-old high school student. And the in vivo codes are put in quotation marks because they do come directly from the text. So the transcript is, I hated school last year. Freshman year it was awful, I hated it, and this year's a lot better actually. I don't know why. I guess over the summer I kind of stopped caring about what other people thought and care more about just, I don't know, it's hard to explain. And so I went back and all of a sudden I found that when I wasn't trying so hard to have people like me and to do what other people wanted, people like me more. And so the coding that's been selected there, the in vivo, the actual words, the in vivo coding is freshman year awful, stopped caring, wasn't trying so hard, people like me more. Emotion codes label the emotions participants recall or which might be inferred by the researcher. If you're doing in vivo coding plus emotion codes, then you would be coding what the person actually recalls, but you could also combine the two, what you think is inferred, as well as what the participant says. This example comes from a research participant talking about her pet cat's illness. When I first learned that my cat had diabetes, I felt like I was in this surrealist dream. The news was given to me over the phone by my vet, and it was said with compassion but urgency, and I was in a whirlwind. I had to give them information on my pharmacy so they could call in an order for insulin and syringes. I remember asking the assistant, "Do you mean a human pharmacy or an animal pharmacy?" And so the coding that's been done there is around surrealistic dream as the emotion that was initially felt, emotion of being in a whirlwind, and then what the researcher has inferred is confusion. So that's the summary from the last bit. So the final coding example I'm going to give you is narrative coding, where you're coding for the elements of a story that's being told. And this is from an interview with a primary school teacher in her second year of teaching. And she says, I think the first year I was just trying to get through. It was a lot to be thrown at as a first year teacher. And now I think I'm much more, I don't know if it's relaxed in the classroom. I still keep moving a lot and doing things, but I'm not going to sit and scream at them to be quiet. I'll just sit there and stare and go, "What are you doing?" "Well, I'm waiting, for you." I think I feel more in control that way instead of the kids being in control all the time. And so the coding there that's been done is conflict around the difficulties of the first year, a flashback, going back, and then coming forward again, comparing the difference between then and now, a vignette telling a little story about what she does in the classroom, and then the resolution of the story that she now feels more in control. We're almost at the end, but I did want to talk about themes before we finish up. Often a theme is used interchangeably with codes and categories, and I've done that myself. But these days I tend to think of a theme as an outcome of coding and categorizing, as a more overarching idea than a code or even a category. And that development of a theme then leads to a higher level of abstraction so that we can be thinking about a theory, which we'll talk about next week. Probably the best thing to do is show you. This is another example that I've taken from Johnny Saldana, and it's from a phenomenological study on belonging. So various people were asked what belonging meant to them, and the data resulted in the following codes. So there are codes of a specific place, feeling grounded, belonging occurring in a unique place, where there are good friends, when you know the culture, when there are good memories, having a sense of ancestry and a sense of identity, being somewhere permanent, and an observation that you don't have to be in the place to belong there. And what Johnny Saldana has done is transform that, or reduce that, I guess, into 3 categories. So he's got a category first of feeling grounded, and within that he's got the ideas of place, culture and identity. Then his second category is being somewhere permanent, so a specific place, a unique place, or even that idea that you don't need to be there to belong. And third category is searching for the ideal, so the idea of really good friends and really good memories. Then what he's done is decided that that can go into some overarching themes. And so what he comes up with is that the theme of belonging is, one theme is an actual place, another theme is a sense of self in that place, and a third theme is an ideal place. And we'll finish now with some of Amanda's reflections and wisdom on how we know when our qualitative research is valid and reliable.
Often when we think about qualitative research, we want to think about, well, how are we being valid? How do we know that our research is valid? How do we know that it is reliable? Through the process of data collection, we use the concept of saturation to essentially assert that we have done sufficient amount of work collecting data. But your reliability and validity of your research also depend on the extent to which you are thorough in your coding exercises. So you code for analytical clarity, you're coding for rigor and thoroughness. It's not about just doing interviews and then sort of taking one pass at the interviews and writing up. People do that, but ostensibly the coding process is something that you go through multiple times in order to ensure that what you code on the first interview makes sense when you get to your 50th interview. So often you'll do your first pass coding through your first 5 interviews and realize by your 6th interview you might need to go back to those first 5 interviews and code them slightly differently because you're realizing that themes are emerging as you're coding. So there's a rigor rigor and a thoroughness to your coding that it's good to attend to in order to be as honest and reliable and valid with your process, and transparent. Transparency is also a really important concept in qualitative work. Take notes about your coding process so that when people ask you, how do you know what you know, you can say, in my first pass, I used these codes, and then after my second pass, I went through and collapsed these codes into these codes. It is as important. Coding and rigor in your coding process is as important as attending to saturation in your data collection process. And we code for theoretical intervention. So coding is the process of moving from small-scale observation to big-scale intervention. How do these small-scale observations accrue to broader understandings and explanations of what happens in the social world?
That's all for today, and a big thank you to Johnny Saldana for his coding manual and to Amanda Flame for her excellent YouTube presentations. And in case you're wondering, I did actually write to Amanda and get her permission to use her work for this lecture. And thank you for listening.